There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's 1987, and Marcus Bullen, his wife Winifred, adult son Lance and daughter-in-law Joan are on their way back to Perth after a lovely time exploring the Aussie outback. They're not in a hurry, stopping to camp, fish and enjoy the peace and quiet as they slowly make their way south from the top end. The outback regions of WA and the Northern Territory are among the most remote on the continent. The kind of places where tourists go for solitude, clear desert night skies, spectacular mountain ranges and wildlife spotting. But they are destinations that come with a warning. Watch out for crocodiles, carry plenty of fuel, stock up on food and water, and beware of the harsh Australian sun. The Bullens, however, are confident campers, unperturbed by the dangers of the bush. On this particular night, the 8th of June, they've decided to set up camp and try their luck catching some barramundi along the banks of the Victoria River. After night one in their new spot, Marcus and Lance decide to take the car out in the morning to see if they can find a better fishing spot. They leave their wives behind at 9 a.m. and tell them they'll come and collect them once they've found somewhere suitable. Unbeknownst to them, a killer is stalking the area, a man intent on murder. About 9 kilometres from their camp, the father and son park their car and make their way to the riverside where they're ambushed. Get down! Put your hands behind your head! In a shocking act of cold-blooded murder, Marcus and Lance are executed with a high-powered rifle. They die within seconds of each other. They're stripped naked and buried in shallow graves. But by the time police are called and their remains are found, the killer is long gone. This is just the start. Josef Thomas Schwab, who will soon become known in the press as the Kimberley Killer, is already on the hunt for his next victim. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. 26-year-old Schwab was a German tourist in Australia on a working visa, an unassuming killer who'd always been shy and polite, a loner type with few friends and a love of guns. He'd actually been to Australia before in his early 20s, finding work as a cabinet maker in South Australia before returning home for a few years. Despite a criminal history for theft, break and enter, and forcibly entering a car, Schwab worked as an armed security guard for 2 years before heading back down under. In April 1987, he arrived in Brisbane, rented a car at the airport, and bought 3 rifles and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Days before he went on his outback killing spree, he sent a postcard home to his mum. "I am looking forward to something," it read.
While the killer's on the loose, there's concern for the safety of everyone in the Kimberley.
If we could put out a warning to persons in that area, persons travelling through the area, to take extreme care and, where possible, keep to the main roads.
And a chilling warning tonight from a leading psychiatrist. Stop the Northwest Killer as soon as possible because he's sure to kill again. Dr. Paul Skerritt, chairman of the College of Psychiatrists who's delved into the minds of our worst mass murderers, says once they have a taste for it, killers like this can't stop.
All up, he murdered 5 people. His next 3 victims, a young engaged couple and their friend, were murdered in an equally as barbaric and violent way. But he died too, robbing his victims' families of their day in court and the police who hunted him of an interrogation. The motives and reasonings behind Schwab's murderous rampage remain a mystery to this day and are unanswered questions that still take up space in the mind of former WA Police Inspector Bob Brown. Brown was part of a tactical response group who helped bring Schwab down, risking his life to make sure the Kimberley Killer didn't murder again. He joins me now. Bob, the WA and the Northern Territory outback, for those of us who haven't experienced it, we've maybe seen some photos, we've seen the desolate nature, it looks hot, it looks very isolated. Do the photos do it justice? What's it like to actually experience that slice of the world?
Well, as a younger police officer, I spent 8.5 years in the Kimberley where all this took place. So I'm very familiar with the country. It is subtropical during the wet season, obviously flooded and lush, hot and humid. But at the time of year we were there, it was dry, tinder dry actually. Unless you've experienced it, it's difficult to explain, but it's an absolutely brilliant country. There's a reason that it's a tourist hotspot, was then and is now, is because it's a brilliant part of the world, but very isolated.
Bob, what were you doing in 1987? Where were you stationed? At what point in your life and career were you at this point in time?
Okay, to put it in perspective, in 1987, Australia-wide, police were developing counter-terrorism and offender response teams. It was a federal government imperative. Each state was expected to draw out 54 personnel and create counter-terrorism cells. Obviously, you can't pluck 54 people off the street as police officers and make them into highly trained, highly motivated, equipped counter-terrorist group. So my job, I was part of the Special Weapons Emergency Team, which was an 8-man cell that was responsible for developing and forming the tactical response group. You can imagine that over 3 or 4 years, this was expected to take place, not instantaneously. But as a consequence of that, our 8-man special weapons team, a lot of the defender operations fell to us. So it was a fairly dangerous, difficult time for that 8-person cell. We also formed a mentoring role for people out on the floor, the 54 people. We're training, churning through, shedding some people, gaining some others. So it was a fairly hectic time for us, a dangerous time in respect of the work we're doing because we were called on only 8 people to do all that work. And that was the perspective, the context of what was happening in 1987 right across Australia. I happened to find myself in that cell when these events unfolded, brutal murders that happened 35 years ago. Before I start, I need to acknowledge that the friends, family and loved ones of the victims, they're forever grieving. And the events are as raw in their mind today as they were at that time. And I've experienced this with them. I'd like to also acknowledge the family of the man responsible for the murders. They remain deeply hurt and perplexed that the man that they loved, undoubtedly loved, could commit such terrible crimes. I think they're still somewhat in denial today. Personally, in behalf of the WA Police Tactical Response Group and the WA Police, I would like to offer sincere condolences.
Thank you for doing that, Bob.
That's okay. It's important.
It is important, and it's a great reminder off the top before we start going into the detail of this story that this is real people, real lives, and people might be listening to it in their ears, but, you know, as you said, it might have been 1987 a few decades ago, but for these people it's so raw still.
I've had conversations with family members. Coincidentally, all the victims are West Australian, even those killed in the Northern Territory. And I've had conversations with them over the years. Yeah, I understand it can be very emotional for them. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that in perspective. Thanks, Gemma.
No, thank you. Let's start with the Bullen family, Marcus and Lance. They were the first victims of this man, this killer. How did they come into the path of Josef Schwab?
The Bullens, father and son, were holidaying with their family. They were fishing on the Victoria River They were ambushed by someone. At this stage, we didn't know who. They were brutally shot dead. They were stripped, crudely buried. The vehicle was driven a short distance and set afire. That's all that was known at that time, but you can appreciate, because of the mindless nature of the crime, the brutal crime, word got around very quickly and there was a sense of growing panic and urgency. Panic on behalf of the population in the Northern Territory and urgency on behalf of the police, who immediately instigated a Northern Territory manhunt. That was, I think, on the 9th of June. It wasn't the luxury there is today, but it was still a tourist mecca. There's a lot of people went up there during this time of year to camp out, to fish. Locals were doing likewise. It was a carefree type of place. But that ended in June that year. Everybody was terrified. There was a madman on the loose, was shooting people indiscriminately, brutally. This obviously attracted huge media interest. There were television crews up there. People, sanctuary and safety with one another by grouping together. People were arming themselves too. People weren't venturing outside of population centres. So the whole place shut down. Now, people were terrified. We were aware of it in Western Australia because it was such a callous crime. And then 4 or 5 or 6 days later, the family from Kununurra, friends and family from Kununurra, were fishing on the banks of the Pentecost River at Home Valley Station, an idyllic spot. You see this in all the brochures. The beautiful mountains behind the Pentecost River crossing. It's an idyllic location. They had come from Kununurra to go fishing with friends. Some friends had left the day before, leaving the 3 of them there. And then we got the chilling news that those 3 had been shot to death under similar circumstances. Their vehicle had been driven away a short distance and set afire. That set off a train of events in Western Australia that included me. Investigators, by the way, did an amazing job throughout this whole episode. Not only the investigators, but then police in the Kimberley focused very much on protecting their communities. Once the knowledge of these murders became common knowledge, people began to draw into townships to gather together. The police set up roadblocks throughout the Kimberley. This was done immediately. Our investigators realised we had a madman on the loose. There was no sense to what had happened. The police in the Kimberley very much focused on protecting their community. And I want to emphasise that these were extremely brave people setting up roadblocks at every strategic point throughout the Kimberley. And they didn't know what they were going to be confronted with. So that was happening when we got the call late that evening. And by 12:30 a.m, my team, the Special Weapons team, as part of the Tactical Response Group, were aboard a small Israeli Westwind jet, 7 of us and a forensic officer, fully loaded, so overloaded with the aircraft that it took the full length of the international runway at Perth Airport to take off at 12:30 a.m. So overcrowded were we with our equipment that one of our team had to be seated in the toilet compartment.
When you touch down, what is it that you are tasked with doing? Because obviously there's investigators that are doing things like the roadblocks. I know that they were getting Indigenous trackers involved. There were aircraft looking for dust plumes of cars. What were you guys directly doing on the ground?
None of that had happened as yet. They had set up roadblocks. You got to remember, because we were dispatched in 2 light aircraft to Home Valley Station.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually went to the crime scene and found the bodies in situ. So when the bodies had been discovered, nobody went back to the crime scene because they didn't know who these people were, how many of them were there, if they were still in the area.
So for the listener, the victims of that second attack were 26-year-old Philip Wolkemeyer, his 25-year-old fiancée Julie Warren, and their friend Terry Bolt. So you arrived and they were still there?
They were still there. They hadn't been moved. And I won't go into the vivid description of what happened, just to suffice to say that similar to the Bullens, weren't buried, but the bodies were treated in the same way. And like I said, the vehicle was driven a short distance and torched. When we got there, the bodies were still in situ. Nothing had been done. The crime scene had not been established. We established the crime scene, set up perimeters. Again, we didn't know what we were dealing with. But then things started to calm down. Our investigators came in and did what they needed to do. I actually jumped on a metal detector and found the spent cartridges. But we weren't sure if there was one or two or many perpetrators. We just didn't know at this stage. The next 5 days, we had aircraft orbiting very high overhead in support of us, police aircraft. Because everybody had gone into population centres, towns, caravan parks for safety and security, but there was still movement, people fleeing to these areas. The high orbiting aircraft identified dust plumes. We would go out and set up vehicle ambushes and dissect these vehicles as they travel on. You can imagine how terrifying it was for tourists. They're travelling on an outback dirt road to suddenly be confronted by armed camouflage police. But it was necessary. And we also had to go to now abandoned station homesteads and overfly them, land, conduct searches of those places. Towards the end of that 5 days, we still didn't know what we were confronted with, but we were nearing exhaustion. And a team of officers in Perth, PRG officers in Perth, were preparing to depart and relieve us. But that's when things started to crystallise as to who we were looking for.
How long were these days you're working? You say you're near exhaustion. Are you waking up and then spending 12, 16 hours a day just working and then trying to get some sleep and do it again? What does that look like?
There was no rest. We obviously had to have rest because if you're fatigued, you can make mistakes. So rest was important, but yeah, it was long days. We had a program of searches and things we needed to do. We were getting information in from our aircraft as to the vehicle movements. You know, this is from 10, 15,000 feet in the air. We're getting information on vehicle movements because obviously vehicles moving on those dirt roads put up plumes. We had things to do, but it was rapidly evolving. And then towards the end of that 5th day, we got further information that a mustering helicopter pilot had seen a vehicle parked in suspicious circumstances about 10 kilometres out of west of Fitzroy Crossing and about 3 kilometres off the road to the south. The helicopter pilot was obviously very much aware of what was happening. He saw a vehicle that had camouflaged netting over it. He stayed long enough to confirm his suspicions, and then he flew and landed in the front yard of the Fitzroy Crossing police station. Just to back up, by this time we had information that a truck driver had been crossing the Pentecost River at that idyllic crossing that everybody knows about. It's in the tourist brochures. He had seen a fire off to his left. Wasn't overly concerned. But then as he crossed over the Pentecost River onto the dusty road and he was driving his truck towards Kununurra, a Toyota 4Runner, distinctive colour, passed him, came through the dust plume, being driven very erratically, and passed him and carried on. Sometime later, he provided that information, and this matched the information provided by the helicopter pilot. So things began to crystallise. We knew of a vehicle, we didn't know how many people. As a consequence of his landing in the front yard of the Fitzroy Crossing police station, and alerting our investigators who were there or thereabouts, we were given that information and we immediately dispatched in an aircraft down to Fitzroy Crossing.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with former WA Police Inspector Bob Brown about Josef Schwab, the Kimberley Killer. For context, at this time there was a rodeo that was in full swing or about to be in full swing at Fitzroy Crossing, which meant there were, thousands of people there. Was that your immediate fear that this person, if it was the killer, was going to attack?
I'm sure that was in the mind of our investigators, but at that time, it was not a concern to us. It became a concern to us later. We knew if this person was still out and about that they were going to kill more people. Because of the random, senseless nature of the murders, we understood that if this person wasn't apprehended, arrested, more murders were going to be committed because we're dealing with a madman.
No one yet knows the identity of the Northwest thrill killer, but this cold-blooded mass murderer is no stranger to psychiatrists. They've seen it all happen before, fortunately only on rare occasions. So far, this latest killer has taken 5 lives, and psychiatrists believe the only predictable factor about him is that he will continue.
Unfortunately, history tends to suggest that patterns like this often are reproduced and, of course, needs to be brought to a stop as soon as possible.
Dr. Skerritt and his colleagues, who have assessed many cold-blooded killers, say deterrents like capital punishment do not work because deeply disturbed people have no control.
Unfortunately, people with these very severe disorders of personality really suffer from an inability to moderate their behaviour and to inhibit the behaviour.
The rodeo, we were isolated somewhat, focused very much on our job on the Pentecost River and the environs. So we flew down back to the Fitzroy Crossing Police Station. We were given a briefing. An aircraft was dispatched. One of our people, our team leader, went off with the aircraft and were able to identify exactly where it is. This is days before GPS or any of those modern conveniences we have today with communication methods. At the briefing, we were given as much information as we could, and then we were driven out 10 kilometres west of Fitzroy Crossing. We disembarked the vehicle, went into what is called an extended line, and started walking in the general direction of the vehicle where it had been identified. We almost immediately started to hear high-powered rifle fire, and that gave us a better sense of direction. But it was 3 kilometres we had to walk in, so that's where we were at that time.
So was that rifle fire directed at you, or the person didn't know you were there yet, did they?
Absolutely not. There was a randomness to it, but it was pretty much continuous, but it was also random, and there'd be gaps in it. As we walked forward and as we got closer, you can appreciate there was a sense of apprehension on behalf of our team. Our aircraft was orbiting out the back, the other side, if you like, of where this vehicle was located. And we believed that he was firing at the aircraft. We continued to walk at a location where we thought we were getting closer. We stopped in a dry creek bed and we had a briefing. The rules of engagement were emphasised. We were there to arrest somebody. We weren't there to shoot somebody. This is the nature of policing. It's not military. Military have a different rules of engagement. We don't. We're civilian police. Our job was, above all else, to apprehend this person. But we're all professional people. We knew our role. But I looked at my colleagues at that time in the creek bed, and I can tell you, every one of us was thinking that we may not make it back alive. That was going through my mind, and I'm sure it was going through my colleagues' mind, because at this stage we could hear the distinct high-powered firearm, and people that have been exposed to high-powered firearm fire will know that there's a, not like your low-powered 22s and whatever, there's actually a concussion in the air when one of these high-powered weapons is fired, and you could actually physically feel it. We still hadn't located the vehicle, but we knew it wasn't too far away. Coincidentally, we lost communication with our aircraft at that time, which was critical. But we had trained with the aircraft. We knew what was going to happen. The aircraft overflew it at a very low altitude and did that a couple of times to point us in the right direction, waggling its wings as it did. So we had a method of communication, but we couldn't talk to them, which was unfortunate, but Murphy's Law. We again formed into the extended line and started to walk forward towards the high-powered gunfire. The aircraft went out the back and they were drawing fire and the attention away from us, from the gunman, as it turned out. So they played a very critical role for us. We were able to move forward. We got to within 75 metres. We were in a dry creek bed. The vehicle was up on the bank slightly. One of my colleagues to the left saw it first and through hand signals pointed out where it was. And at that stage, we ran forward.
Do you remember seeing Josef Schwab for the first time? What did he look like in that moment?
Coincidentally, you appreciate an extended line. I was on the extreme right, and my colleagues, 6 of them were extended out over about 100 metres off to my left. It was just coincidental that I was closer to him than anybody else because of the nature of our progress forward. And so I probably was the only one that had a very clear view of him. He was standing at the front of his vehicle on the bull bar. He had his back to me. He had camouflage trousers. He was bare from the waist up. He was armed with a telescopic-sighted, high-powered 7.62 bolt-action rifle. And he was aiming at the police aircraft and fired a shot as I watched him. And then, to my dismay, he looked to his left and he's obviously spotted my colleagues extended out to my left. And he has twisted and fired an instinctive round, unsighted instinctive round. And then he drew the rifle up and took a deliberate aim through the telescopic sight, probably at the same target, one of my colleagues. I was left in this situation where I had a millisecond to do something. So I was armed with a M16, fully automatic M16. It's a military weapon. I was only 40, 50 metres from him, and I aimed at his face, his nose, his weapon, and fired off a 2-round burst. I didn't see the fall of shot, but he sprinted. He was obviously very startled. He didn't get to fire that shot. He was very startled. He ran back around his vehicle, unarmed at the stage. As it transpired, it probably was me that blew his thumb off and destroyed the weapon.
But he had more weapons, didn't he?
Yes, he went sprinted back, got into the open door of his car. Then he was inside his vehicle. The team leader on my left yelled out to police, stop firing, or words to that effect. He yelled out a warning to him to give himself up. And then one of my colleagues, as we're trained to do, put in what I call a flight rod. It's a barricade penetrating pyrotechnic CS gas cartridge. He put in 3 or 4 in very quick succession. Amazing, the job he did. But one penetrated the windscreen, another couple ricocheted off the car, and consequently set fire to the tinder drive, of course. But then this man jumped out of the car armed with a deadly little bastard of a gun called a Ruger Mini 14. It's a high-powered carbine with a 30-round magazine, quite capable, and fired one hand, which he did. He's obviously slightly hindered by the fact that his left thumb was blown off. But so determined was he that he engaged us with this Ruger Mini 14. Almost instantaneously, the bush had set fire. There was smoke. It was absolute chaos. But he continued to fire us, and he very quickly disappeared through the smoke to an area just adjacent or behind his vehicle and continued to engage us in fire. We had to maintain momentum. You cannot sit back. This is part of our training. If you allow them to consolidate, any armed defender, allow them to consolidate and think, it can be a problem. So momentum was a very important thing to us. So this is what we had to do next.
What happens next? I understand there was a point where you made a run for the car.
Yeah, that was part of maintaining momentum, and that's part of our training. We said I was closest to him than anybody else. I ran forward, asked for covering fire from my colleagues. I ran forward to an anthill about 30 metres from the vehicle. I then put in covering fire. I couldn't see him. And my colleague ran to me, or to another anthill to my left. I then again asked for covering fire, and I ran to the vehicle, trying to keep the vehicle between me and where I believed him to be. At this stage, the vehicle had started to catch fire. My colleague ran to me. We weren't sure if there were other people in the car. We were aware of the evidential value of the vehicle. I handed my weapon to my colleague and I said, I'm going to drive it out. I got into the vehicle, opened the passenger door, slid across as best I could, keeping a very low profile. Fell across and I could feel the keys in the ignition. Turned the key and the engine fired up. My colleague was saying to me, you're covered. And at this stage there were flames coming into the vehicle from open rear windows. The back of my hair was singed. I managed to drive it out, probably 20, 30 metres out of the flames, and called on my colleagues to cover me, and I came back to them. They had taken cover and were putting in covering fire. It may be that the gunman was dead by this time. We don't know. My colleagues were all putting in covering fire or suppressing fire. Things had calmed down a little bit. We still believed he may have been firing at us. We weren't sure. Then, to gain communication, my colleagues went back to the main body, 40 metres behind us. They went back and I stayed where I was. I was taking cover behind an anthill in a bush. Underneath that bush, this fellow had stored thousands of rounds of ammunition. And as I was about to make my way back under covering fire, this ammunition exploded within centimetres of my head. There's no danger in the ammunition exploding, I can tell you, because ammunition, once it's not contained in a barrel, it can be very noisy and very untidy. Didn't believe that I was in any danger. It was just, I just put my head down and waited for the rounds to expend. And that took about maybe a minute. So I couldn't move. I looked over, I could see my colleagues behind me. We weren't exactly sure what was going on. The fire from the gunman had pretty much ceased. Police aircraft, was an outstanding airmanship from our pilots. And I looked up from my position. The aircraft would have been no more than 30 feet above me, standing on its left wing. But they were able to communicate from that first flyover that there was a person about 30 metres in front of the point man, which happened to be me laying on the ground. They then did a very impressive wing over, came back slightly higher. They then were able to report that that same person had not moved. They could see blood on that person. As it turns out, it's the gunman. So then there was verbal communication between me and my colleagues behind me. And they got up and walked towards me, gathered me up as we walked through. We walked through very cautiously. And there lay Josef Schwab. As it turns out, he was face down. There was a hole between his shoulder blades. His firearm was speared into the ground by its barrel, so it was sticking out of the ground. He was likely dead before he hit the deck. But our job hadn't finished there. We then started to fight the fire, probably for the next 20 minutes, and extinguished that. And then we calmed things down. We moved away because it was a crime scene. A person was dead. And then we were able to communicate with the investigators back in Fitzroy Crossing, where they were closer now. And they trundled in through the bush because it was trackless country. They trundled in through the bush and, like I said, there ended the life of Josef Schwab. I would love to have spoken to him to find out why he did the things he did, but we will never, ever, ever know.
And first up tonight, one of the biggest ever manhunts this state has seen ended this afternoon in a hail of bullets. Police officers from the Crack Tactical Response Group in Fitzroy Crossing gunned down a man they believe was the Craze Killer, responsible for murdering 5 people in the northwest over the past week.
An intensive land and air search for the murderer was over at 3 o'clock this afternoon in the north of the state. A search helicopter pilot spotted the Toyota 4Runner vehicle stolen by the crazed killer. It was found 10 kilometres out of the Fitzroy Crossing township, camouflaged under a canopy of bushes. TRG officers were flown from Kununurra to the crossing this afternoon. When they approached the vehicle, a man alighted and opened fire on them with a high-powered rifle. Officers returned fire, fatally wounding the gunman. He died at the scene. The killer's death comes after a week of anger, frustration and heartbreak for the families of the 5 dead people.
How did it feel to see that Schwab had been killed? Did you have a hope that you might be able to apprehend him, or once this all started happening, was it just would have been impossible to try and get him alive?
He would have had to put his hands up and become compliant. If he'd have done that immediately when he was warned to stop firing, and with the police and to stop firing, it would have ended differently, and maybe it would have been an entirely different chapter. But he was so determined. I mean, this man is badly injured. The injuries he sustained where the left thumb was removed. He had a shrapnel wound to his backside. People speculated he was bullet riddled and whatever. With professional people, there was none of that nonsense went on. He said a single wound that killed him. We don't know who fired it. We never will. The bullet exited his chest and it was never located. There was no deliberate move to shoot him between the shoulder blades. He was just engaging in fire and movement, and that was he was going from one anthill, as we found out, because the little piles of ammunition where he'd go to one anthill, fire off a number of rounds, move to another anthill, fire off a number of rounds, and that's how he proceeded. It was sort of like a military precision, and he had some military training. But at some stage during that, through the smoke, a round has struck him between the shoulder blades. How I feel today, I felt a sense of satisfaction that none of my people or our people had been injured, because we sincerely believed that some may not be returning to their loved ones, considering what we're confronted with. So a sense of satisfaction that nobody was injured and this man was not going to cause any more damage. How it's affected me today, I don't have any lasting effect apart from the fact that if I'm in the bush, and I do spend a lot of time, I'm a prospector and miner, I spend a lot of time north of Coolgardie, I'm more vigilant. I'm more protective of the people that are with me, and I'm more personally vigilant if I see a car coming. So that's the only ongoing effect.
Bob, are you still in touch with the families of those victims? How did they take all of this news?
I'm sure they felt huge relief that the murderer of their loved one had been brought to justice, and in this case, justifiably shot dead. I'm sure that, and that feeling was ubiquitous right across, not just Western Australia, but right across the top end, which is one big family. Far North Queensland, Northern Territory, the Kimberley, they were absolutely relieved. And there was an outpouring of appreciation to us as a team. The people of Fitzroy Crossing delivered us a couple of cartons of beer on the aircraft. On the way back, the pilot told people on the aircraft, a commercial aircraft, that they had us on board, and there was applause. As a consequence of what we did, there was a Team Bravery Award. We were nominated for it by somebody that was anonymous. After 30 years, we received a Team Bravery citation. We're very privileged to go along to be presented with a medallion by the Honourable Bomber Beasley, the Governor of Western Australia, and that was only a couple of years ago. So never sought recognition because it was our job.
Well, that Bravery Award is certainly deserved, because what you guys did was...
And it was a team effort, Gemma. It really was. And anybody would have behaved the way I did, but I just happened to be in a position to do what I did. So it was a very emotional time. Yeah, there was a sense of relief, I'm sure, by the families, I'm sure by everybody in the Kimberley. But I can tell you that the grandchildren, children, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, they're still very much affected and still very much grieving.
Thanks to Bob for assisting us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.